All right, we're in Class 2, Chapter 1, and I'm excited about sharing with you this content because as you view the questions on the workbook, you'll be able to be guided in thought to focus on the details. Don't let it be a distraction if listening to my quickly spoken words help you process this information. The first half of this book, the first half of this chapter deal with stories and illustrations to introduce the subject that then defines what a boundary is. That's what we're dealing with. What is a boundary? And in the book pages 15 through 27 are illustrations. So we're going essentially 14 pages into the book before we get to the definition. It's well worth the time to the best of our ability. And I want to say a huge disclaimer. In the intent of the book, there are some things not having to be addressed. And I will say it up front so that your mind is not flagging saying, yeah, but, and not focusing on what's being shared. So I will say that personal boundaries does not negate mutual accountability. That has to be there, and he's getting to that. So last week we dealt with a tale of two couples, a couple that grew well over time and a couple that did not grow closer together over time because of lack of properly applying these respectful treatments of one another and personal boundaries. Part 1 is what we're dealing with tonight, but over the months of January and February, this is the bulk of the class. We're going to deal with 6 to 7 values and how to apply them in a relationship. We're focusing on how our marriages and our homes and all relationships can be enhanced by the preachings of God's truths. These are eternal truths within that we are going to apply to our lives. Sadly, part 3 we won't even deal with except in sermon material later on because resolving conflict is key. I want to know how to resolve the conflict, but first we need to understand why is there conflict, and then we can move with methodology from there. That being stated, let's have some fun. Chapter 1, what is a boundary? Say a prayer for me and say a prayer for yourself. This is the moment where we go through a lot of material as fast as we can, but not confusing. Just lose yourself in the story, and I'll do my best to speak read for your benefit. If you have the newer printing of the book, it's page 15. Remember Stephanie from the video we first saw last week? Stephanie sat in front of the fireplace drinking her cup of herbal tea and reflecting upon the evening. Her husband, Steve, had gone to bed an hour earlier, but the gnawing feeling in her stomach prevented her from joining him. In fact, the feeling was so propelling her away from him. She was relieved when he had said he was tired, for she didn't know what she would have done if he had wanted to make love to her. So the feeling of relief scared her. She knew that it was not a good sign for their relationship. As she thought about the night, she found herself connecting her feelings not only with what had happened this evening, but with what had gone on in their relationship the last few years. She was pulling away from Steve more and more. She knew that she loved him and always would love him. She just didn't know how to get past the lack of attraction to him. She had a negative feeling about their relationship that she could not shake. And her friend Jill, get specific. What is it? Get specific. She could hear her friend Jill asking. Jill, was much better at sorting out thoughts and feelings than Stephanie. As she sorted through the answers to Jill's question in her mind, the answer came surprisingly quickly, like a movie-like collage of memories. Times and conversations that she and Steve had passed through her mind as though she were a detached observer. Here. First, she recalled this evening when he had ignored her wishes for where they would go to dinner. I wish for this, I would like that. And several times during the meal, he had ignored what she was saying. It was as if he did not really hear her. As Steve would often say, this is the Steve we know, that's a sign of showing value or not, based if you listen or not. Then there was their vacation. She had wanted a nice, quiet mountain setting where they could be alone together. He had wanted a big city with lots of action. And as usual, they followed his wishes. Then there was her desire to go back to school and finish her degree. That was in the video. They had agreed on that when she had dropped out of college her senior year to put him through law school. But every time she brought it up, he explained why it was not a good time for them right now. Stephanie had a hard time understanding that. What he was really saying was that it was not a good time for him. Many other scenes came to her mind, but that phrase, for him, seemed to encapsulate all of them. Their relationship was more for him than it was for them, or even for her. As she thought about it, her detachment gave way to anger and contempt. Of course it would. Quickly, she retreated from such a negative feeling. Of course she would. By saying, get a grip, she told herself. Love is filled with sacrifice, right? But as much as she tried to see herself sacrificing for love, she felt as if she were sacrificing a lot, yet experiencing very little love. With that thought, she stared into the fire a little longer, gulped her last sip of tea, headed to bed, hoping that he would be asleep. That's a scenario ought not to have ever been, but here it is. So we're going to talk about, on page 16, the importance of boundaries, and the narrative goes along. Now, could you read this on your own? Of course. Do you? That's the other question. If you hear it dramatized in the class, it may help. As we, again, focus on the material many times, several things come out to us every time. Enjoy this. How had Stephanie, after several years of marriage, found herself in such a state? What had gone wrong? She and Steve had begun so strong. He was everything he always wanted: kind, strong, successful, and spiritual. Steve seemed to embody it all. But as time went on, their relationship lacked depth and intimacy. She could not understand how she could love someone so much and experience such little love along the way. The issues are different for many couples, but the perplexity is often the same. One spouse feels something is missing, but can't figure out what it is. She tries to do the right things, gives, sacrifices, honors the commitment, and believes the best, and yet doesn't achieve intimacy. Or worse than that, she doesn't avoid pain. It's always there. In some cases, the confusion hides itself behind the simplistic explanations that problems such as addiction, irresponsibility, control, or abuse all provide. If he weren't so controlling, or if she would just stop spending. Partners think that they can explain why their relationship lacks intimacy by the presence of the problem. They are surprised to find that even when the problem goes away, the person with whom they can't connect or find love remains. So in other cases, there are, or there may be, no problems, but the marriage does not live up to the promise that one or both of the partners had at the beginning. Commitment may be strong, but love, intimacy, and deep sharing are not present. Why does this happen with two people who are so committed to the relationship? Well, one issue is boundaries, as the book will define. When boundaries are not established in the beginning of the marriage, or when they break down, the marriages break down as well. Or when such marriages don't grow past the initial attraction and transform into real intimacy, they never reach the true knowing of each other and ongoing ability to abide in love and grow as individuals, as a couple. The long-term fulfillment that God designed. For this intimacy to develop and grow, there must be boundaries. So this chapter takes a big look at what the whole book 1 was about. What is it? What is a boundary? In the simplest sense, a boundary is a property line, and it denotes where something begins and something ends. He mentioned on the video last week that you can get a plot map and show your property and where your neighbor's property ends and where yours begin. And that's good. Once you know that, then you can take ownership of many things. We're going to talk about ownership now. If you know where the property lines are, you can look up who owns the land. In physical property, we say that Sam and Susie owns the land and everything on it. In relationships, ownership is also very important. If I know where the boundaries are in our relationship, I know who owns such things as feelings, attitudes, and behaviors as well. I know to whom they belong, and therefore, if there's a problem with one of those, I know where the problem lies. A relationship like marriage requires each person to have a sense of ownership of himself and or herself. And sometimes in discussion, it's revealed that both have a problem in one way or another, so that's why challenges are opportunities to grow closer. He says, I, Dr. Cloud, witnessed this lack of ownership in a couple recently, and I'm going to have fun dramatizing this in the wording. Caroline and Joe came in for a marriage counseling session and saying that they just could not stop arguing with one another. When I asked her what the arguments were about, Caroline replied, he is just so angry all the time. He gets so mad at me, and that really hurts. He is so mean sometimes. I turned to Joe and asked, why do you get so mad? Without having to think for a second, he replied, because she always tries to control me in my life. Sensing that this could also become a game of ping pong, I looked to one side and then the other, and I asked Caroline, why do you try to control him? And again, in a millisecond, she responded, because he is so into his own things that I can't get his time or attention, which represents a problem, of course, but the reaction to it is very different. Each of them blamed their own behavior on the other one. So that's the emphasis of the author. Each of them blamed their own behavior on the other. Sensing that they might see the humor in what they were doing if I continued, I even then asked, why do you not pay attention to her? So it's back and forth, back and forth. Because she is so nagging and controlling, I just have to get away from her. Instantly, he shot back. Trying one last time to have someone take ownership for their own behavior, I asked, and why does she nag? Without missing a beat, she answered, because he won't do anything I want. I wanted them to see my head moving back and forth whenever I asked a question, why do you? Why do you? The answer given always was something about the other person. The ball of ownership was hit back over the net each time it landed in one of their courts. Neither one took personal ownership of his or her behavior. In their minds, their behavior was literally caused by the other. I longed for Joe to say, for example, if I get angry, you know what? I get angry at her because I'm too immature to respond to her more helpfully. I'm deeply sorry for that, and I need some help. I want to be able to love her correctly, no matter what her behavior is. Can you help me with this? Oh, that response would be music to a counselor's ears, but with this couple, we were a long way from that symphony. I felt it was as if I was in the bleachers of the Garden of Eden when God confronted Adam after he sinned in Genesis chapter 3. There was no doubt about it. Adam had done it. When God asked Adam what had happened, he got the same lack of ownership that we saw in Caroline and Joe. Who told you that you were naked? God asked. Have you eaten from the tree I commanded you not to eat from? The woman that you put here with me, she gave me some fruit and I did eat. Adam blamed his behavior on his wife, just like Joe, just like all of us. I did this or that because of you. And God ran into the same problem with Eve when he asked her about her behavior. Look at what happened. What is this you have done? God asked. Well, the serpent deceived me and I ate. Eve's behavior and disobedience get explained away on the account of the serpent. If it weren't for the serpent, and I'll add this joke that you well know, and so God went to the serpent, and sure enough, he soon didn't have a leg to stand on. That's just a little joke, a little pun there, all right? But in essence, Caroline and Joe, like Adam and Eve, and like you and me, were saying, if it were not for you, I would be more loving and responsible as a person. It's going to bring a lot of things to light. So the first way in which clarifying boundaries helps us to know where one person ends and another begins, and shall I say overlap. What is the problem and where is it? Is it in you? Is it in me? Or both? And if so, why? Once we know the boundaries, we know who should be owning whichever problem we are wrestling with. For example, Joe was not taking ownership of his feelings and Caroline of her behavior. So in this case, there were two problems, feelings and behaviors, and you can know where those property lines are. Let's look at responsibility on page 20 here. We're getting closer to where we want to be. Boundaries help us determine who is responsible for what. If we understand who owns what, then we know who must take responsibility for it. If I could get Joe to see that his reactions were the problem and not Caroline's, then I could help him take responsibility for changing his reactions. As long as he blamed Caroline for his reactions, then she had to change for his reactions to change. Is that going to happen? In his mind, If she were not so controlling, for example, he would not be so angry. If we can discover who is responsible for what, we have the opportunity for change. And of course, I'll say that conflicts are learning opportunities. If we can see that the problem is our problem, if it is, to the degree that it is, and that we are responsible for it, then we are in the driver's seat for change. The first time we are empowered, when Caroline got a sense of that, she was responsible for the misery that she thought Joe was causing. She was empowered to change that helpless, powerless feeling of misery, no matter what Joe was doing. Once she began to take responsibility for her reactions to Joe, she could work on changing them. For example, she learned not to dismiss the anger, but to not let his behavior anger her, negatively that is, and affect her to respond to him more directly. So how do you respond is the key. Not action, but a reaction. So she also learned to stop nagging to him to do things and instead give him some choices and details to come. Responsibilities also involves action. If something is going to happen, something has to be done for it. We need to take charge and take change of things like attitudes, behaviors, reactions, or choices. We must actively participate in the resolution or whatever relation problem we have, even if it's not our fault. Okay, I'm going to take a breath break. Once Joe saw that his anger was his problem and not Caroline's, he took responsibility for it. He learned he was not going to be not angry because Caroline changed. No, I know that's a double negatives there. He was going to be not angry because he grew. That's why he was going to be not angry. He grew and responded differently to what she did. He learned what Proverbs teaches, that in Proverbs 25:28, that a lack of boundaries, well, it's not worded this way, and anger go hand in hand. Like a city that is broken into and without walls is a man who has no control over his spirit. So he learned not to react, but to think through his choices, to find where his anger and feelings of being threatened by her were coming from, and then to deal with those emotions properly. I've often said that you never should deny your emotions. They're usually a warning flag that something is wrong with perception, understanding, expectation, or even the reaction of a preference behavior. So that's something to consider. So that's where, like David said in a previous class, anger itself is not a sin, but what you do with it could be. Many other new things become part of his growth, but they all began with boundaries, with clarifying what he had to take responsibility for. What's my accountability? Each spouse must take responsibility for the following things, and they're listed on the screen. These are amazing things that you are to take accountability for. Feelings, attitudes, behaviors, choices, limits, desires, thoughts, values, talents, and love. There's a lot to learn there. Like, wow. So responsibility tells us that we are the ones who must work through our feelings and learn how to deal with them differently. Our attitudes, not those of the spouse, cause us to feel distressed or powerless. So how we behave and react is part of the problem, and how we have to change these patterns is our accountability. We allow ourselves to get pushed beyond certain limits when they become resentful or powerless. We do not turn desires into accomplished goals, or we do not deal with those ill desires. So based on how we look at boundaries or what we can and can't do results in either the pain that we allow to be inflicted on ourselves or that we don't prevent, is my commentary on that. I want to aid this in his last paragraph, worded much more simply. Responsibility empowers us to have a good life. To give Adam and Eve the responsibility God gave for them to be empowered to have the life that we all desire. He doesn't take a doctrinal approach here, but I like his principle. God gave them the ability to have a life filled with love and wonderful surroundings, lots of opportunities to use abilities and talents. He gave them the ability and the opportunity to make the life they chose. When they did not choose in a life-loving way, they also bore the responsibility for that choice as well, just as we do. I'll emphasize as a preacher, sin ruined the relationship. It ruined everything. This is why we struggle in our relationships, because of sin and the selfishness that has no part in the relationship. But This is where we're having to learn boundaries in a sin-fallen world to have a marriage that represents God in all things and helps us grow closer to Him in holiness, which is the purpose for marriage. So the last paragraph in this portion says, but the good news of boundaries is that God's plan of responsibility has not changed. Each spouse can act both to avoid being a victim of the other spouse's problems and, better yet, to change the marriage relationship itself. Even if your spouse is not interested in changing, but the process always begins with taking responsibility for your own part in the problem. So this will help us in all of our relationships, and we'll see how much material we cover in the remaining time. I was hesitant, but then I realized this might be a two-parter because the first part are the stories, the second part deals with how we apply it, and so we might just make it that way. Here we are, freedom on page 22. I like the idea of freedom, and a lot of people do as well. His irresponsibility is making my life miserable, Jen began. She then went on to tell me a terrible story of how her husband had successfully avoided adulthood for so many years at her expense. She had suffered greatly at the hands of his behavior, both financially and sexually. As I listened, though, I could see that her deep sense of hopelessness kept her in prison. I could see countless ways she could be free from her husband's patterns of behavior. She could make numerous choices to help both herself and the relationship. But the sad thing was that she could not see the same choices that were so clear to me. For example, why don't you stop paying for his mistakes and bailing him out? Why do you keep rescuing him from the messes he gets himself into? I asked. What are you talking about? Jen asked, alternating between muffled sobs and a scornful expression. There's nothing I can do. That's just the way he is, and I have to deal with it. I could not tell if she was sad about what she perceived as a hopeless case, or if she was angry with me for suggesting that she had choices. As we talked further, I discovered an underlying problem that kept Jen from making such choices. Here it is. She did not experience herself as a free agent. It never occurred to her that she had the freedom to respond, to make choices, to limit the ways his behavior affected her. Again, I'll clarify, this is not talking about negating the covenant accountability of mutual respect and love. This is how you deal with one another to praise honor in God in the marriage. She felt that she was a victim of whatever he did or whatever he did not do. This was the same problem troubling Joe and causing him to react so severely to Caroline. She would attempt to control him, and he would experience her attempts as actually controlling him. I had to read that again. She would attempt to control him, and he would experience her attempts as actually controlling him. So in reality, Caroline had no control over Joe whatsoever, and he had understood that. He would not have been so reactive to her. He did not see himself as a free agent either. To be fair, I'll have to say that spouses, if you're connected, you will be affected. If you're connected, you will be affected. But he's getting to that later. Right now, in this portion, God designed the entire relationship within creation for freedom. Freedom not void of responsibility. We were not meant to be enslaved by each other. We were meant to love each other freely, and God designed us to have freedom of choice as we responded to life, to other people, and to God, and to ourselves. But when we turned from God, we lost our freedom. We became enslaved to sin, self-centeredness, to other people, to guilt, and to a whole host of other relational dynamics. But boundaries help us realize that our freedoms, once again, listen to the way that Paul tells the Galatians to set boundaries of any type of control and become free. This man is not going to reference the doctrinal context, of course, so it fits him to use this for his purposes. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject to the yoke of slavery. Well, Jen felt herself enslaved by her husband's patterns of behavior and did not see the choices available to her. Joe saw himself as a subject to Caroline's nagging attempts at controlling him. But God tells us to not be subject to any kind of enslaving control at all. Now, he's focusing on relational, of course. So when someone realizes the freedom that he or she has from a spouse to anyone else, many options open up. Once you realize that you are accountable for your reactions and in that way free from many things that otherwise would control you, then you have opportunities and you are empowered in this sense to react responsibly, hopefully. Boundaries help us to know where someone's control begins and ends. As with the property lines, so it is with relationships. Just as your next door neighbor can't force you to paint your house purple or pink, neither can any other human being make you do anything. Now, in other words, we decide. We have the power to decide. For love to work, each spouse has to realize or acknowledge his or her freedom and that of the other person. Marriage is not slavery. It's a binding covenant based on a love relationship deeply rooted in freedom. Each partner is free from the other and therefore free to love one another. And he mentioned that in the video last week. If you're free from the other, that makes you an individual, autonomous, in that you have then the ability to choose to love. And love is a choice. And I'll add this. Confusing control with leadership is a perversion of God's pattern. That's my words, not the author's. Confusing control with leadership is a perversion of God's pattern. So here is God's pattern by way of a chart. You have three realities that existed at the beginning of time. You have freedom, responsibility, and love. Freedom, responsibility, and love. That triangle cannot exist or stand if you remove any of them. I'll read a few things and probably conclude with this portion. And I'm excited for what remains, and I think it can work well for the next class. God created us free. He gave us responsibility for our freedom. And as responsible free agents, we are told to love Him and love each other. Follow the logic theologically of this as well, philosophically. This emphasis runs throughout the whole Bible. When we do these three things, live free, take responsibility for your own freedom, and then love God and each other, then life, including marriage, can be an Eden experience. As they act more responsibly, they become more loving. As love grows, so does freedom, leading to more responsibility. And that means leading to more love. Responsibility here is opportunity, knowledge of knowing how to act and carry it out. So you learn more, you are empowered to do more, and you choose to do more, which develops the relationship. So love grows as you realize these dynamics of your own boundaries, yet to be defined in this class. Here we go. The reality, this is really neat. The idea that because of who you are individually, helping each other grow to be who God wants you to be. So, the really neat thing is that both had become a catalyst for growth for the other person and for the relationship as well. The spouses were free to not react to the other. They each took responsibility for their own issues, and they loved the other person, even when he or she does not deserve it. Now, right now, I'm just going to say the book does not address how to deal with conflict. It's just giving you the foundation to know that it can be dealt with, in many ways prevent it, and we'll deal with some of those conflict issues later. Love can only exist when freedom and responsibility are operating. Love creates more freedom. That leads to more responsibility, which leads to more ability to love. So now we're talking about protection. We have a few minutes to focus on this particular portion and share one story that I think will conclude the class. And I'm looking at the teaching portion that remains. That's the part I was eager to get to the most, and so I'll have all of class time, Lord willing, next time for that. But if you're with me on the book, page 26, this is key, protection. You've got to have, that's what boundaries are all about. The last aspect of boundaries that makes love grow is protection. Think of your house for a moment. You probably have some protection around your property. Gates, for example, locked doors from trespassers. Some people, if they were able, would come in and steal the things that matter to you. You need to be careful and protect yourself from evil. But your locked gate or door is not a wall either. You need to be able to open the gate or door when you want to invite good guys or good people into your property or line or into your house. In other words, boundaries need to be permeable. They need to keep the bad out and allow the good in. So, here's a story for you. Regina had had enough. Married to Lee for 19 years. She had tried to be loving until it had almost killed her emotionally. Lee had a long-standing problem with alcohol, and also with anger. Sometimes the two problems would come together and make life unbearable for her. In addition, she would pick at her, when I said he, sorry. In addition, he, Lee, would pick at her in an emotionally devastating way with biting, sarcastic remarks. Things like, nice dress, did they have it in your size? Was the kind of things he would say. He would not help her with the kids either, seeing that as the wife's job. She was an adapting, loving person who had always tried to avoid conflict and to win people over with love. When people were mean, she would become nicer and try to love them more. That is to say, she wasn't properly practicing boundaries. The problem with Lee was that her love only gave him more and more permission to be unloving himself. His drinking and other behaviors continued to get more and more pronounced, and she finally could not take it anymore. She discovered that it was not good to be the silent sufferer. Some people at her church would encourage her to speak up to Lee about how his problems were affecting her. She took some courses on assertiveness and began to confront him. Sadly, Lee did not listen. Sometimes he ignored her confrontations. At other times, he apologized without changing. And at still other times, he grew angry and defensive. But at no time did he take her words to heart to see how he was hurting her and change. Regina finally gave Lee a choice to own his problem and take responsibility for it, or to move out. That was a key. She would no longer allow his drinking and anger to affect her and the children. She would take protective steps to guard the good and not let evil destroy it. At first, he did not believe her, but she stood her ground. Finally, he moved out. Had he not done so, she might have moved out herself or gone to court. But seeing for the first time that his behavior had consequences, Lee took his problem seriously. He then obtained some help and turned his life around. He and Regina were reconciled a year and a half later, and their marriage was saved. Regina was happy that they were back together and that the marriage was doing well. This was a fruit of the protective stance she had so painfully taken. And it all changed, of course, once the limits were seen, the property lines of her well-being. This was a fruit of the protective stance that she painfully took. She had set some limits and boundaries to protect herself, children, and ultimately her marriage from a destructive cycle. Thankfully, I haven't heard the bell, but I'm eager. I'm always eager to move forward. I'm always the type of guy in teaching. I like a good thought question after I've learned, but I like to just tell me what I need to know. And I hope that you don't mind the same, at least tonight. So under the category self-control, page 28 in the book, this is too good not to share tonight. There's a lot of misunderstanding about boundaries, lest you misunderstand from the stories that we've shared. Some people are against boundaries because they seem as selfish. Frankly, when another person has good boundaries, that threatens the people who want control, which is a selfish feeling. So think about that. Other people actually use them to be selfish because, they misuse them in a way that manipulates, and both are wrong. So, boundaries are basically about self-control. Self-control, a fruit of the Spirit. A client once said to me, I set some boundaries on my husband. And I don't know how the terminology would be, but I told him that he could not talk to me that way anymore. And it did not work. What do I do now? I replied, what you've just done is not boundaries at all. What do you mean? It was your feeble attempt at controlling your husband, and that never works. I went on to explain that boundaries are not something you set on another person. Boundaries are about yourself. My client could not understand. Well, let me reword this. My client did not say or could not say to her husband, you can't speak to me that way. This demand is unenforceable. But she could say what she would or would not do if he spoke to her that way again. Beginning to see application clarity now. She could set a boundary on herself. She could say, if you speak to me that way again, I will, and then fill in the blank with whatever's prudent. In this case, the book types walk out the room or hang up. This threat is totally enforceable because it has to do with her. She would be setting a boundary with the only person she could control, herself. When you build a fence around your yard, you do so that you can maintain control of what happens to your own property. If someone trespasses your personal boundary in some way, you can take control of yourself and not allow yourself to be enslaved, hurt, or controlled anymore. This is self-control. We learn this stuff, but it's just good to hear it laid out. And ultimately, last paragraph, self-control serves love, not selfishness. We hope that when you take control of yourself, you will love better and more purposefully and intentionally, so that you and your spouse can have the intimacy that you desire. And I have desire to let just the few remaining pages in chapter 1 be what we conclude with in this chapter next week. This chapter 1 is all about what boundaries are, the first book that introduced me to the series. And the challenge is having the wisdom to know how to apply it. But the more you face scenarios that you haven't seen yet in life, and many of you have gone through so much, but you're still learning, that's a little different, then you can learn more about yourself. And isn't that what marriage is about? Learning yourself. I can say I know more about myself in 13 plus years of marriage than I had ever in the years up to that point as a bachelor combined, because it's a different dynamic as you choose to lovingly respect the other person, and then it reveals so much more. There's a lot that we've discussed tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have preparing for it. Next week we'll slow down, because those are the narratives, those are the stories, the problems that can happen if you don't know what boundaries are, how to set them, and how to properly show love. And ideally, it helps when you have the other person. But you see how these principles also apply in all relationships? It just carries over in how you learn one another. And we're going to just conclude the class on that one. I want to show you the title screen. That's next. And yes, the title screen. Next class, after Christmas Day. The following Wednesday will be this in chapter 2, but we're going to conclude next time and probably review the clips that we've already seen so that we can refresh our minds on what boundaries are, and then go into the teaching material that remains regarding the areas of life that we can use, tools that God has given us to enforce these boundaries. That should be interesting, and we'll enjoy some fellowship. Thank you all so much.